Thank you for the invitation here. It's a great honor to be here as a keynote, and also just it's nice to have the opportunity to kind of test out some new ideas that I've been thinking in terms of framing some of my work. And so this is not really as Alexei advertised. It's actually more about national identity in Kazakhstan and how the migration pressure from Russia has caused a lot of let's say, discussions in Kazakhstan about national identity. So there are certain dates from this year that will forever stick in our minds. One is February 24th. Russia invades Ukraine. I remember where I was when Russia started bombing Kyiv. I was in class. One of my students shouted out, "Oh my God, they're bombing Kyiv!" And he just burst out, and I'll never forget this shared experience. Probably many of you remember where you were as well. This day set off a powerful set of emotions, reactions, actions throughout the world, but especially in Eurasia. So other events I think also stand out, whether we remember the specific dates associated with them or not. The sort of partial mobilization of Russian forces to continue war in Ukraine in September, which set off a wave of migration like really nothing we've ever seen in the whole entire world. When else have we seen members of a former colonizer leave their country in droves to find refuge in exactly those places that they had colonized not so long ago? Are these occurrences events, or are they processes? This is the question that I'd like to organize my thoughts around today. I would like to acknowledge first and foremost that the creation of knowledge is a shared process. So my thoughts on this topic have been formed in community with students, with colleagues, with friends and family, and I share any credit for good ideas with this community. Any bad ideas or anything that's too radical, I will definitely happily take the entire blame for myself. As a researcher on migration and national identity in Eurasian space, I have not separated myself from the process of collecting data or creating analysis. For me, it's been a lived experience that I've brought my full entire self to, including emotions, biases, privileges, hopes, and dreams. This right now, today, this year, this decade, I think is a transformative moment in Kazakhstan, and I believe it's one that is worth engaging in fully. Because we are people in process, which means that we have agency, it also means that we can't really separate the scholarly parts of ourselves from the parts that are simply human. So I contend that by taking a more unified approach to things that we consider to be important political events, instead of pulling them apart into configurations of variables, we will come to a more authentic knowledge of how what we call exogenous shocks are actually deeply embedded in processes that are poorly understood if we try to simplify the complex nuances at play. So I should say up front that the event is something that's much debated in philosophy. I'll try not to get too much into the weeds about the debates because I'm not sure that I could really do proper justice to the nuances. But different philosophers conceive of the event as made up of different aspects. And some, namely Alfred North Whitehead and other process thinkers, see events not as contrasting with processes, but indeed as part and parcel of processes themselves. In other words, not all philosophers of the event would contrast them as it seems like I'm doing in this talk. But indeed, I'm actually not suggesting that events are separate from processes. But they're actually deeply and inextricably embedded within those processes. And this has implications for how we do social science, because how we conceive ontologically of the things that make up our world have direct epistemological and methodological implications for how we create knowledge and how we consider certain types of knowledge worthy of scientific status. So what I'm suggesting is not an either-or, events or processes, but rather a complex unity of the whole. And that said, let me suggest a few contrasts that come from an events-only perspective versus a wider sort of process perspective. Events are discrete. Processes are entangled. Events beg for causes. Processes work in unities, not variables or single causes. Events are disruption-oriented. They focus not on the everyday or the regime or the routine. They cloud our vision of actually what happens regularly. Processes allow agency without insisting on rationality. Events are numbers-focused. Processes are not readily quantifiable. Events give agency to the powerful, whereas processes equalize agency. Process thinking looks at systems and structures not as those things that create constraints, as we often look at institutions, focusing on impossibilities, but rather process thinking looks at systems and structures in a biological way, as inextricable organismic wholes in which all of the parts have creative potential or agency. But how does this matter? How does this view matter for thinking about migration and identity in Eurasia? I'll suggest that there are two underlying processes that are unsettled, open-ended, and ultimately unpredictable that any events or episodes related to migration and identity are embedded within. The first is national identity perception and practice in Kazakhstan. There are many, many open questions related to national identity that I will contend have come into sharper focus during the process of migration of many Russians to Kazakhstan. The second process is the continued imperial power of Russia, intentions, actions, and also the decolonial attitudes, movements, and activities of those in Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and other states and people in Russia's sphere of influence, which has also produced a sort of sharpened sense of solidarity across borders as a result of the war in Ukraine. And indeed, even these processes of national identity and imperialism and decolonialism, all of these processes are also intertwined. They're not completely separate processes. So what I'd like to do is think together through several moments or episodes or events that can benefit from a broader look at the processes that these moments are embedded in. So the field of many of these episodes is online, meaning that while they may have happened first and foremost in a sort of embodied way as interactions between discrete individuals, the way they resonate in society is through traditional and especially social media. But that is not where the field ends. And I say this for the sake of those that are engaged in digital ethnography, which has become increasingly popular. Okay. Because we live actually hybrid lives, not fully online, not fully offline. So we need to understand the interlinkages of these conversations that are happening both online and offline. And one or the other in isolation simply won't be enough to give proper credit to the social field that we're trying to understand. So the first episode. Che Krim, or who does Crimea belong to? So when Russia's military mobilization was announced, droves of military-aged men left the country, left Russia. Many came to Kazakhstan. And we've all heard stories of the Uralsk movie theater opening up its doors to Russians as a place to stay, long hours, lines that were hours long at the border. Kazakhstan opened up special branches of SON, or the Citizen Services Center, to process EEN or tax IDs and other types of documents specifically for Russians. And amid these activities, there were many conversations about whether these draft dodgers were acting out of conscience or self-preservation. And many of these conversations arose out of a sense of solidarity with Ukraine and wanting to be on the right side of history, with Russia and any Russians associated with a pro-war stance being clearly on the wrong side of history. Sometimes the reactions arose also out of a more routine sense of what I call migration myths, or the ideas that kind of circulate in many immigrant-receiving countries that migrants take our jobs, migrants are a threat to our culture, migrants are a threat to our security. We also heard these types of rhetorics. But the idea of testing the newcomers to see what their political commitments were became a popular sort of practice. And one of these filter questions was Che Krim, or who does Crimea belong to? A particular moment came when a viral video of a citizen of Kazakhstan, pictured here in the middle, interviewed two newcomers on camera, and their answers were, let's say, less than satisfactory. I suspect anything other than an immediate and unequivocal statement that Crimea belongs to Ukraine and Ukraine only would have been not acceptable. It's not a question of history, though, or nuance. It's a filter question. It's a filter question that's being used to test political loyalty. And what stuck out to me as I was thinking about this episode is that the Russian men here on the right that were being asked the question clearly had no idea what they were supposed to say. It was clear that there was a right and wrong answer to the question, but they didn't know what that right or wrong answer was. And so my question is this an example of imperial ignorance, or is it a more entangled moment? And I think it certainly starts with imperial ignorance, which is a result of an education that only tells history from a very narrowed perspective. And imperial ignorance is not unique to Russia or Russians. I will, in full self-disclosure, I will tell you an example of my own imperial ignorance, which came soon after I arrived to Kazakhstan. I was invited, along with a group of colleagues, including Professor Troshev, to the Institute for Modern History for some discussion. You might want to ask him later if he remembers these events in the same way. And one of the questions they asked me directly as an American was, I would say, a filter question. Who won World War II? I had no idea what the right answer to this question was, right? Because I've been educated, I was educated in a very narrow historical space that told history in a particular way. My answer was, we did, which was just ambiguous enough that it hid the fact that I was completely naive to the depth of ownership and identity that victory in World War II plays in this region. So when these boys were equivocating over who Crimea belongs to, it made me think that sometimes we just don't know the right answers to the questions that are being asked us because we're so limited in our view of the world that we really can't conceive of how to go forward. I think there's another aspect of this question about Crimea that's important, though. When these questions occur on camera, we shouldn't understate the role of paranoia and experience of surveillance, meaning that these Russians who had just left their country as dissident draft dodgers may have been reluctant to speak freely if they think their words could be used against them later. In our own research, we're doing research right now on Russian immigrants coming to Kazakhstan. We've encountered some who were nervous about being interviewed, thinking that we were agents of the security services of Russia, and they were kind of questioning our intentions. Now, of course, we don't want to victimize even those Russians that are leaving, because we also want those people to reckon with the sins of their forefathers and walk forward in a sense of the cost of reconciliation and responsibility. But thinking about their complex identities is also necessary. So for many watchers of Russia, these Russian draft dodgers are a symbol. Many are deliberately dehumanizing them if they don't act according to certain scripts. And this is a part of the heightened sense of justice and solidarity that the war in Ukraine brings. But I would ask, what are we really seeking in these questions? And if the question is a filter, and there are clearly right and wrong answers, then the question is being used to simplify and sort people into people, real people, good people, and monsters. If the question is the start of an ongoing conversation, on the other hand, we need to consider that the process will be fraught with uncertainty, lack of knowledge, ignorance, especially at the beginning. Episode 2. The Choco life scandal. This was also a viral social media episode around a month ago. So the company Choco Life is a big company in Kazakhstan that does lots of different things. In this picture, they were providing a training to newly hired Russians from Russia. And the video of the event shows this woman, the facilitator of the training, explaining to the new Russian employees that if people speak to them in Kazakh, it shouldn't be taken as a sign of aggression. Instead, they should understand and respect the language realities on the ground. Ramil Mukharyapov, the founder of Choco Life, was standing off to the side here at this table. And he interrupted the facilitator to say that someone who can speak Russian but answers in Kazakh anyways is demonstrating nationalism. Now, this viral video created a huge discussion, huge criticisms, boycotts of the company and its subsidiaries, and eventually an apology from Mukharyapov. How should we think of this moment? What does it mean to speak Kazakh? What does it mean to speak Russian? As we've asked Russian emigres why they chose Kazakhstan as a destination, many have said that Russian language makes things easier. Now, this is a double-edged sword because, yes, it makes it easier to adapt to life in Kazakhstan, but can also become a crutch that prevents further integration. Willingness to speak Kazakh has become another filter point. I remember several years ago when the name of the hospital, Центр материнства и детства, where my second and third children were born, changed the sign on their building. Previously it had been Russian and Kazakh, and they changed it to Kazakh only. And at the time, I felt marginalized as a Russian speaker, but not a Kazakh speaker. I realize now, though, that that is a reaction of privilege. And it's an example of not wanting to lose power that comes along with privilege. Now I feel more like I'm missing out if I don't speak Kazakh, which I still don't. And that there are amazing things to unlock in a sphere that I don't have access to. And this is a very different position. And indeed, there is a moment of enthusiasm for Kazakh language that is not felt by ethnic Kazakhs alone. This seems to have, of course, decolonial contours as a reaction to the war in Ukraine. But I think it's more. I think it starts with a sort of habituation or a recognition of the place of Kazakh language as embedded in society, even if and when it is not actively used. I think there's also a sort of repentance and differentiation aspect to the language revival. It's the idea that, at least for Kazakhstani Russians, that they are different from Russians from Russia, that they are signaling their understanding of Kazakhstan as their home. Now, this is one of the major things that the mobilization-driven migration has highlighted, that Russians are different than Kazakhstani Russians. And this is not something new, but it has been revealed in a new way. So our current research, as well as previous research by one of our former students, Darina Junusova, who's now at Georgetown, shows that when Kazakhstani Russians go to Russia, they're considered Kazakh. They're seen as outsiders. They feel like outsiders. They are called Kazakhs. Now, to us, that sounds weird, right? Because it turns out, though, that there's no concept of Kazakhstani in Russia, not only in Russia, but also further abroad. But the question becomes why outsiders get to decide what it means to be Kazakh. And this is another example, I would say, of imperial ignorance, that people outside of Kazakhstan have no clue and often no curiosity for how multiculturalism and diversity are negotiated in Kazakhstan. But back to the language issue. It is an oversimplification, I would say, to equate national identity with language. It is simply not true in Kazakhstan that ethnicity and language map cleanly onto one another. It's also crucially important to realize that national identity is more than language. This is an ongoing problem in Kazakhstan, and I think it really needs to be resolved. A couple of questions going forward that I think need to be wrestled with is how open will Kazakh language be to Russians and other ethnic minorities? Will Kazakh language revival go beyond a sort of symbolic language usage to a full bilingualism? Is this necessary? If some people cannot learn Kazakh for whatever reason, will they still have other ways of proving their loyalty to Kazakhstan and enjoying the full benefits of citizenship? And what other narratives will comprise an inclusive national identity that integrates Kazakh identity and multicultural identity that allows non-Kazakhs to be full citizens with all the rights and benefits regardless of their ethnicity or language repertoire? So, such as is it possible to build on narratives of shared experience that have nothing to do with language? or feelings of home and belonging to a place, which may be Kazakhstan, or it actually may be more local identities, which are also important to recognize how we think in a very sort of methodologically nationalist terms. We think about national identities without kind of breaking them down into the salient local identities that might actually be more felt by people. For this process, creativity is needed, and this is a very process philosophy concept. So in order to think of new expressions of national identity that are not top-down, that are negotiated through discussions among ordinary people and through sparks of new ideas that come through these interactions, creativity really needs to be central. Episode 3. The Solovyov Circus. Earlier this week on Russia's First Channel program, Evening with Vladimir Solovyov, the Russian talking heads warned that the same Nazi processes that forced Russia to intervene in Ukraine can easily start in Kazakhstan because of the long land border and because there are many Russians in Kazakhstan. Now, indeed, of course, there are both those Russians that belong to Kazakhstan and those newcomers who are Russian citizens, many Russians in Kazakhstan. In fact, one of the palpable fears of migration in response to the mobilization was that it would create a pretense for Russian intervention. Now, this type of rhetorical threat is not uncommon, it's not new. Not only do these rhetorics have resonance in social media, but they also play out at the level of diplomatic discourse. Kazakhstani leaders have indeed sometimes taken bold stances against Russia since the start of the invasion, but they've also sometimes taken a much weaker stance than the public would prefer. And this is a tension of state function, that state elites and citizens have different ideas and different priorities. And political scientists, myself included, actually I'm differentiating myself, have sold the world a bill of goods by presenting states as unitary actors and naturalizing the state, whatever that is, as the most relevant unit of analysis. And this is actually an impoverished perspective that produces arguments like John Mearsheimer's that has become so famous recently that the primary blame for Russia's invasion lies with NATO expansion. These types of explanations look to single causes as explanations for complex phenomenon. In reality, a state is made up of a complex array of actors. The state, I like to say, is an arena of barely controlled chaos, given that power and decision-making is divided amongst a vast array of agents and institutions acting officially in the name of the state. A process perspective allows agency of all of these actors in the state and in society to A process perspective allows agency of all of these actors, both the ones who act in the name of the state and those who make up society that the state is intertwined with. Rather than looking at what elites do and how that constrains the agency of ordinary citizens, we can instead focus on the available space for action. And this is not what the usual politics of authoritarianism does. It tends to focus on closures rather than openings. But indeed, what do these openings look like? And this leads us to episode 4. The Phosphate protests. This week, in Taras, more than 200 workers at the company Phosphate protested, demanding an apology from a manager, a Russian citizen, who called the employees sheep. The demands of the workers were not only for an apology, but also included other issues such as wage adjustments. The Akimat later issued a statement that this was not an interethnic conflict. Now, this is a very typical type of framing by government officials, but I would contend that it's also a dangerous way of framing events like this because it says, we don't talk about these things. It does not invite discussion, and it doesn't offer people the opportunity to find routinized, institutionalized, public ways of resolving conflict. These conflicts and conversations are indeed occurring. in embodied forms, such as the protests around kitchen tables and cafes, and online and hybrid forms. These are the everyday spaces for action. They are spaces of action in spite of constraints. These discussions are not a danger, they're an opportunity. So conflict in this sense doesn't necessarily signal dysfunction, it simply offers an opportunity for collective problem solving. Now, if we think in traditional social science terms, we tend to separate what we call error from our explanations. But a process perspective integrates uncertainty, mistakes, conflicts into the fabric of our frameworks. So this type of approach allows for messiness and allows that not all questions will have perfect answers, but that the questions themselves and the discussion that surrounds those questions are crucially important. This is not to say, of course, that there aren't top-down efforts to try to channel these conversations. These are also occurring. But it sometimes requires a closer look. Sorry, I lost my place again. These are also the efforts by the top are also occurring, and this is actually really interesting. I recently heard a story where a government agency was making some sort of promotional video, and the entire thing had to be reshot because someone in the video said Kazakhstani rather than the people of Kazakhstan, which apparently is a newly approved official framing. That was the first I'd heard of it 2 days ago. I'm interested to know if anybody else has heard of this as well. This is a very sort of top-down framing that comes seemingly out of nowhere and then imposes itself on society. So these efforts are occurring, these top-down efforts are occurring as well. But in the end, these top-down approaches are not enough, and they do not stop the micro-level conversations from going forward. But it does require social scientists to look beyond typical categories, epistemological frameworks, methodological tools that are associated with either authoritarianism or closed civil society in order to find and see and recognize these sort of micro spaces where activity is actually occurring. I call this an epistemology of hope that leads quite naturally from a process ontology because it looks rather than at what is not possible, at what is possible. It focuses on the agency of individuals within systems in the way that parts of the system allow organisms to function. It does not focus on closures and constraints, but opportunities. It looks at the everyday micropolitics of how people act in relationship to people around them. So what do we do with all of this? What's next as a scholarly agenda?